Chapter 1. The Tea That Turned Cold. It was a perfect day for tea. The sun hovered lazily above the hedgerows, and the gentle breeze carried with it the scent of honeysuckle and just-mown grass. The villagers of Weatherwood gathered that afternoon in the vicarage garden, smiling over teacups and scones, while pretending not to eye one another too closely. It was Mrs. Ellingham's idea, a summer tea to raise funds for the church roof, and she was rather determined that no one leave without contributing at least 5 shillings or a jam jar. Miss Marple, wrapped in a pale blue shawl despite the warmth, sat beneath a striped awning, her gloved hands folded in her lap. From her perch beside the camellia bush, she had the perfect view of every corner of the vicar's lawn, and what she saw would have troubled anyone with less experience of the wickedness that dwells behind kind eyes and warm cakes. I always find that charity brings out the most curious traits in people, Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to the vicar's wife beside her, who was preoccupied with balancing a plate of cucumber sandwiches and answering 3 questions about raffle tickets at once. Near the lemonade table, Mr. Arthur Smythe, retired banker and local boor, was loudly declaring that the entire village would go bankrupt over a few missing slates. He had just poured an extraordinary amount of sugar into his tea, stirred it twice, tasted it with a wince, then added more. "Must have gone damp," he grumbled. Beside him stood his much younger wife, Clarissa, all pearls and perfect posture, laughing politely while her eyes wandered toward the rose trellis, where Dr. Henry Linton spoke in hushed tones with Florence Murch, the postmistress. Florence's cheeks were flushed. Not with sun, Miss Marple noted, but with embarrassment or something sharper. Just then came the clang of the brass bell, Mrs. Ellingham's signal that the raffle was to begin. Everyone shuffled to the front, some out of genuine excitement, others for show. Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze drifting to the side table where the sugar jar sat, its lid slightly ajar, the edges damp and sticky. Half an hour later, the tea was over. Laughter still lingered in the hedges, but the vicarage lawn had grown quieter. As the guests slowly made their way home, there was a rustle of unease. For it was Mr. Smythe who had stumbled as he rose, knocking his saucer to the ground and grasping his chest with a pale, trembling hand. "Oh, do stop being dramatic, Arthur," Clarissa had said at first, reaching to steady him. But then he collapsed, face forward, the buttons of his vest crushed into the grass, his teacup spinning twice before tipping over. His lips were blue, and the tea had turned cold. 2 hours later, Dr. Linton stood in the sitting room of the vicarage with a stethoscope around his neck and a grim look on his face. "I'm not ready to say anything conclusive," he told Inspector Harrow, who had been summoned from Market Weatherly. "But it appears to have been sudden cardiac arrest." Clarissa Smythe sat dazed on the divan, her hands motionless on her lap, as Mrs. Ellingham fetched a damp cloth. Miss Marple remained near the window, unobtrusive as ever, listening more carefully than anyone realized. "The man was healthy," the inspector muttered. "No prior complaints. Nothing that would explain this. Unless you've reason to suspect poisoning?" Dr. Linton hesitated, then glanced briefly toward the empty teacup on the table. "It's too soon to say, but I wouldn't rule it out." At that moment, Florence Murch appeared at the door, her lips pressed thin. "Excuse me, but I thought you might want to know. The sugar jar was missing for a bit during tea. I found it near the hydrangeas. Odd, isn't it?" The inspector's head turned. "Missing, was it?" "Yes, and when I opened it, it smelled strange. Not quite like sugar ought to." "Where is it now?" "I left it in the kitchen. Figured I'd best not touch it again." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her fingers gently tapped the edge of her armrest. She had noticed something. Not just the sugar, not just a teacup, but a small, almost invisible detail that meant something. A pattern, a behavior, something awfully human. Sugar's such a curious thing, isn't it? She said aloud, addressing no one in particular. It has a way of bringing out both bitterness and sweetness in equal measure. And some people take it very seriously indeed. Inspector Harrow gave her a glance, not suspicious, merely amused. Miss Marple, you do say the strangest things. She smiled, ever so politely. Only when necessary, Inspector. Outside, the sun dipped behind the willows. The church bell rang for evening prayers. And Weatherwood, so quaint and peaceful only hours before, bristled with the knowledge that murder may have visited the vicarage tea. Miss Marple, quiet and composed, leaned forward slightly. For the sugar jar was not the only thing that had been tampered with that day, and she intended to find out why. Chapter 2. The village reacts. By the next morning, the news had woven its way through Weatherwood like ivy on old stone. Arthur Smythe, dead in the middle of Mrs. Ellingham's summer tea, had become the talk of every kitchen and shop in the village. And while the coroner had yet to issue a statement, that small omission did nothing to stop the flow of speculation rising like steam from 100 teapots. At Pritchard's grocery, Miss Howard leaned across the counter toward Mrs. Finch and whispered in the conspiratorial tone of one accustomed to scandal. They say he choked on a wasp, right in his tea, poor man. Mrs. Finch snorted. Don't be ridiculous. Dr. Linton said his heart gave out. Though if you ask me, it's the wife we ought to be looking at. Clarissa's no widow in mourning, is she? I saw her smiling, mind you, when she left the vicarage. Grief shows itself in peculiar ways, muttered Miss Howard, though she tucked that detail away like a keepsake. Still, she is rather young for him. And too pretty by half, added Mr. Pritchard from behind a display of oranges. That's always trouble. Meanwhile, at the hairdresser's, Mrs. Templeton recounted, between snips of scissors, how she had seen Florence Murch arguing with Mr. Smythe 2 weeks earlier about a parcel. Very red in the face she was, and Florence doesn't forget a grudge, not her. You remember that flap over the misdelivered telegram last Christmas? Arthur Smythe had a knack for offending nearly everyone, replied her hairdresser with a shrug. Wouldn't be surprised if someone finally snapped. And at the churchyard, old Mr. Ellis took it upon himself to remind the groundskeeper that Smythe had once tried to block the installation of a war memorial plaque. Fought the council tooth and nail, Ellis muttered, poking at a dandelion with his cane. Said it was a waste of funds. Called it emotional indulgence, if you can believe it. I reckon there's more than one soul pleased he's gone. By mid-morning, the entire village had produced a list of plausible suspects, each tied to some minor quarrel, unpaid debt, or whispered insult. Yet as the gossip grew livelier, Miss Marple sat in her parlor with her knitting resting quietly on her lap, her mind sifting the chatter with the same precision she applied to unraveling dropped stitches. She had received 3 visitors already, each under the guise of innocent curiosity. First came Mrs. Ellingham, her lace collar askew, and her nerves barely held together with pins and propriety. I do hope this doesn't affect next month's harvest fair, she fretted, eyes darting about Miss Marple's cottage like someone expecting to find poison among the teacups. I doubt it will, Miss Marple said gently, though I expect you may find fewer volunteers for refreshments. Mrs. Ellingham winced. Do you think it could have been deliberate? The sugar, I mean. It's such a dreadful thought. Miss Marple only gave her a thoughtful look. It's always worth considering, whether an action was accidental or chosen. One tells you about chance, the other about character. Mrs. Ellingham blinked, gave a nervous smile, and excused herself with a rustle of skirts. Next came young Timothy Brent, all tweed and adrenaline. He worked as a solicitor's clerk in Market Weatherly and fancied himself something of a sleuth. Poison, Miss Marple, don't you think? It's all too neat otherwise. Dropping dead like that. I looked up poisons last night. Arsenic, strychnine, cyanide. They're frightfully easy to mix into things, you know. Yes, Miss Marple said mildly, though it's usually not the chemistry that solves it. It's the psychology. Timothy looked confused. Psychology? She smiled. The way someone behaves before and after. Guilt often shows long before anyone's caught. Finally, Florence Murch herself arrived, holding a small paper bag of lemon buns as peace offering. I thought you might want some company, she said, though her eyes did not meet Miss Marple's. You're very kind, Miss Marple replied, motioning her to sit. I imagine it's been a trying morning. Florence hesitated. People are talking about the sugar jar. I never meant to start a fuss. I only said it smelled odd, which it did. Of course, you were right to mention it. I didn't touch it again, just left it on the scullery shelf. But now people are saying I must have had the best chance to tamper with it. Miss Marple leaned forward, pouring 2 cups of tea with her usual quiet care. And did you? No, I wouldn't have the faintest idea how. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Sometimes, it's not about knowing how, but why. Florence shifted uncomfortably and changed the subject. But Miss Marple had already stored away the flush in her cheeks, the flicker in her voice, the slight tremble when she held the cup. When Florence had gone, Miss Marple rose from her chair and wandered to her window. The lane outside was dappled with sunlight, calm and charming as ever. Yet beneath the surface of Weatherwood, something jagged pulsed. A man was dead. And though the village turned it into theater, something real, something cruel had happened beneath the bunting and lemon drizzle. She returned to her knitting. 2 rows of pearl, 3 rows of plain. A pattern emerging. The police would look for fingerprints. The villagers for gossip. But Miss Marple? She would look for the smallest change in the rhythm of ordinary life. And already, it had begun to change. Chapter 3. The Early Investigation. Inspector Harrow returned to Weatherwood the following day, boots freshly polished, mustache a little more bristled than usual. He didn't like village murders. They were deceptive, wrapped in doilies and politeness, with poison concealed under jam tarts. Much easier when a man was shot in a bar fight or stabbed behind a warehouse. But when the victim had been drinking tea on a lawn surrounded by vicars, postmistresses, and pensioners, the motives tended to be tangled, knotted like knitting gone wrong. He began at the vicarage. The sugar jar had already been sent off to the county lab, but he had no illusions about a quick answer. In the meantime, there were people to speak to, routines to unravel, and temperaments to test. Miss Marple, for her part, had not been invited to assist. She never was. Yet somehow, she always seemed to be exactly where she needed to be. That morning, she was arranging hydrangeas at St. Luke's altar, while the inspector spoke to Reverend Ellingham in the adjoining vestry. I'm told Mrs. Smythe was less than devastated, Harrow said bluntly. The vicar, a kindly man with little fondness for gossip, hesitated. She was composed. But I wouldn't draw conclusions from that, Inspector. Clarissa is not one for theatrical displays. No tears? I believe she excused herself quietly to the side garden. I did not follow. Harrow made a note. And Mr. Smythe's health? Any known complaints? None that he shared with me, though he did mention headaches some weeks back. Perhaps indigestion. He ate rather heavily. And his character? The vicar sighed. Well, he was generous to the church, I must say that. But not universally liked. Abrasive to some. He could be impatient. Harrow raised an eyebrow. With whom? With most people, I'm afraid. Meanwhile, Miss Marple listened not with her ears, but with her eyes. She noticed the hesitation in the vicar's fingers as he adjusted the hymnals. She noted the faint trace of cigarette ash along the windowsill, an odd place for Mr. Smythe to have leaned, perhaps in frustration or secrecy. From the church, Harrow moved next to the Smythe residence. The house was quiet. Clarissa greeted him with the grace of someone used to entertaining guests rather than policemen. She wore gray today, modest, but not black. "I suppose you've come to ask whether I murdered my husband," she said lightly as she poured coffee. "I've come to ask about the events leading up to his death," Harrow replied, stone-faced. Clarissa gave a little shrug, as though that were the same thing. Arthur had been irritable lately, restless. He complained about the vicarage tea, said it was a waste of a Saturday, but he went because I insisted. "Did he have any enemies?" She smiled. "Arthur had strong opinions. He didn't care much how people took them." "Did he trust you?" She looked him full in the face then, her eyes sharp. "He didn't trust anyone, Inspector. He kept a separate bank account I wasn't allowed to touch. He read my letters when he thought I wasn't looking. You might say Arthur lived in a fortress and made sure I did too." "Were you unhappy?" She set the coffee pot down. "I was married." The inspector left shortly after, with more questions than answers. Clarissa's calm was not a relief. It was an irritant, like perfume in a sealed room. By afternoon, Harrow turned to Florence Murch. She met him at the post office, stiff-backed and pale, the keys to the sorting room clutched in her hand like a shield. "You had an argument with Mr. Smythe recently," he began without preamble. Florence blinked. "Yes. He accused me of misdelivering a check to his wife, which I hadn't. It was clearly addressed to her." "Did you resent him?" "I resented his tone. But that's hardly a crime, is it? Did you serve him tea at the vicarage?" "Number Mrs. Ellingham was doing most of that. I only helped with napkins and raffle tickets." "Did you touch the sugar jar?" Her lips tightened. "I moved it when someone left it near the edge of the table, that's all." Inspector Harrow made a note. He didn't particularly like Florence, but he didn't think she was a killer. Her emotions ran too close to the surface. Whoever had done this, he thought, had been very calm indeed. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the linden trees and shadows stretched across the garden walls, Miss Marple made her way to the Smythes' home. She had come under the guise of returning a borrowed book, gardening for shaded borders, but Clarissa seemed unsurprised by the visit. "You want to know if I loved him?" Clarissa said, not unkindly. Miss Marple looked up from her teacup. "That would be an impertinent question." "But true nonetheless." Clarissa set down her embroidery. "I respected him. I was grateful in a way. But no, Miss Marple. I did not love him. I think he knew that. And that may have been the worst wound of all." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "There is a peculiar kind of violence in silence, my dear, especially when the silence is mutual." She rose to leave but paused at the door. "One last thing, Mrs. Smythe. You didn't happen to see who returned the sugar jar to the table, did you?" Clarissa's eyes narrowed just slightly. "I thought it was Florence, but now that you mention it, I can't be sure." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "It's often the smallest movements that matter most." Outside, the evening air was crisp, and the scent of roses lingered faintly. The village remained serene on the surface, but Miss Marple could feel it shifting, like a calm lake with something restless moving just beneath. She knew that somewhere among the glances, the teacups, the sticky sugar jar, and the silence, the truth waited to be plucked free, and she would find it. Chapter 4. The First Suspects. The following morning brought with it no rain, no thunderclap of truth, no dramatic confession. just sunlight diffused through a veil of mist, and the low murmur of village routine brushing up against unease. By now, the idea that Arthur Smythe had been poisoned had settled into the minds of Weatherwood's residents like the smell of lavender in old linens, pervasive, faintly cloying, and impossible to ignore. Inspector Harrow returned with a clearer strategy. He needed a suspect, someone plausible, someone the village would nod about in agreement. And he had two options forming in parallel. Florence Murch, prickly and nervous with motive and proximity, or Clarissa Smythe, the elegant widow whose grief seemed too well behaved. He began with Florence. She had always been slightly apart from the village's social rhythm, diligent, solitary, proud. Her interactions were often tinged with defensiveness, as if she expected to be doubted. This morning she arrived at the police station in a brown wool coat that didn't quite match the weather, and clutched her handbag like a lifebuoy. "You told me before," Harrow began, "that you found the sugar jar away from the table." Florence nodded. "Near the hydrangeas. And you moved it back?" "Yes. Did anyone see you?" She blinked. "No, not that I know of." "Why was it moved in the first place?" She hesitated. "I assumed someone had spilled it, or perhaps a child had been playing." "You didn't check the contents?" "I did. That's how I noticed the smell." "Describe it." Florence's face twisted as she searched for the right word. Sharp, bitter, not right for sugar. "And you're certain no one else touched it after you?" Her eyes darted, uncertain. I don't know." Harrow tapped his pen against the table. "Florence, did you know Mr. Smythe was changing the terms of his will?" Florence looked startled. "Number, why would I know that?" "You work at the post office. You handle documents, envelopes." "But not private papers. I would never—" "I'm told he posted a letter the week before his death to a solicitor in London. Would have passed through your hands." "I don't read people's post," she said sharply, but her knuckles whitened against her bag. The inspector let the silence hang before dismissing her. She rose with stiff dignity, but her stride wavered as she stepped outside. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, seated that same morning at her usual table in the Bluebell Café, received a very different perspective. Mrs. Hartley, the butcher's wife, had sat herself down opposite without invitation, claiming she simply couldn't face another minute of speculation without going quite mad. "It's that Clarissa," she whispered, stirring her coffee twice without drinking. "Far too calm. And I don't care what anyone says. She was carrying something when she left the garden that day. I saw it tucked beneath her shawl." "What kind of something?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "A glass jar, small, like the sort you keep mustard in." Miss Marple's needles paused. "And where did she go afterward?" "Toward the lane behind the vicarage. She said she needed air. But I watched from the rose arch. 5 minutes later, she came back and her shawl was empty." Miss Marple gave a slow, quiet nod. The detail was curious. Not conclusive, but very curious. She returned home that afternoon and reread her own notes, small scribbles in the margins of her gardening calendar. People revealed themselves in their habits, not their alibis. The trouble was, both women had habits that obscured as much as they revealed. Clarissa, the graceful widow, had moved like someone accustomed to eyes upon her. Composed, polished, and yet— the glass jar, the change of shawl, the marriage she never mourned. Florence, on the other hand, had too much emotion. She bristled, flushed, denied. She had proximity but no elegance. That alone would be enough to paint her guilty in the eyes of the village. But Miss Marple was not the village. That evening, Inspector Harrow held an informal meeting in the parish hall, ostensibly to update concerned citizens, but more truthfully to observe their reactions. Miss Marple, seated in the back row, knitting something in pale yellow wool, watched closely. I want to be clear, Harrow said, his voice firm, that this is an active investigation. The coroner's report is pending, and we are treating Mr. Smythe's death as suspicious. Murmurs rippled through the room. He continued, We're aware that the sugar may have been tampered with. We are not ruling out any possibilities, and we are conducting interviews with those who had access to refreshments that day. All eyes turned, some subtly, some openly, toward Florence and Clarissa. The former sat ramrod straight, lips pressed together. The latter leaned back, unreadable, a soft frown on her face. Miss Marple didn't watch them, though. She watched Dr. Linton, seated off to the side, legs crossed, arms folded. The way he glanced toward Clarissa, then quickly away. The stiffness in his jaw. A small, soft click in her mind. She said nothing. She never did. Not yet. But a new line had begun in her knitting pattern, and it didn't belong to Florence or Clarissa at all. After the meeting, as the villagers filed out into the dusk, Miss Marple lingered at the doorway. Inspector Harrow passed her, offering a tired smile. Getting closer? She asked. Maybe. I've got 2 suspects with motives and opportunity. But something still doesn't fit. Miss Marple gave a delicate shrug. Sometimes, when things don't fit, it's because the piece isn't part of the puzzle at all. And with that, she slipped away into the evening mist, the tip of her umbrella clicking faintly on the cobblestones. The suspects were gathering, yes, but so were the cracks in the story, and Miss Marple, gentle as a sigh, was beginning to follow them. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The village awoke to the clatter of milk bottles and the hollow echo of news whispered behind lace curtains. By now, most had resigned themselves to the idea that Arthur Smythe had been murdered, and that one of their own had done it. Suspicion lingered like smoke after a bonfire, clinging to sleeves and scenting every conversation. Yet in her rose-covered cottage, Miss Marple was less concerned with rumor and more with detail. A knock at the door came just after 11. It was young Emily Finch, the vicar's daughter, arms full of old church bulletins. "I've brought the minutes from last month's committee meeting," she chirped. "Mum said you wanted to see if we'd listed who brought which dish for the tea." "Very thoughtful of her, and of you," Miss Marple said, leading her to the table. "It can be such a tangle, recalling small things after the fact. A written record, even one intended for jam-scone logistics, can be most revealing." She leafed through the yellowing pages as Emily chatted. It was all there. Who brought what? Who arrived late? Who forgot the doilies? And then, a quiet pause. Under refreshments, it read, "Sugar bowl from Mrs. C's kitchen, confirmed by Florence." Miss Marple blinked once. Mrs. C. Not Clarissa, but Mrs. Chudley. Eleanor Chudley was rarely discussed in Weatherwood, though she lived quite visibly on the edge of the village in a vine-smothered cottage that used to be her late brother's. She had withdrawn from most public gatherings after a quarrel with Arthur Smythe some 3 years prior. He had blocked her petition for a village art fair, citing her lack of professionalism as justification. She had not forgiven him. And yet, her sugar jar had ended up at the vicarage tea? How curious. After Emily left, Miss Marple fetched her gloves and made her way toward the outskirts of the village, umbrella in hand, not for weather, but for comfort. Eleanor's garden was overgrown and lovely in its disarray, like something from a forgotten novel. She opened the door before Miss Marple could knock. "I knew you'd come," she said simply. "Oh?" Miss Marple tilted her head. Eleanor stepped aside. "Everyone thinks I had nothing to do with the tea. But someone took my jar, Jane, from my kitchen." Miss Marple settled into a faded armchair, noting the scent of lavender and turpentine. Canvases lined the walls, most unfinished. In one corner sat a small cupboard with its door ajar, revealing an empty shelf. "I noticed the vicar's minutes said the sugar bowl came from your kitchen," Miss Marple said gently. Eleanor gave a tight nod. "It did, but not with my consent. Someone must have come in and taken it the day before the event. I'd made preserves that morning, left the back door open. When I went to fetch sugar later, it was gone." "Did you report it?" "To whom?" Eleanor scoffed. "They'd have thought I was chasing ghosts. No one listens when you're not part of the tea, Rhoda." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "But you remembered, and you saw the jar at the tea?" "Yes. I recognized the chip near the rim. I kept quiet, but I knew. And I thought, if someone had done something dreadful, they meant it to point to me." Miss Marple leaned back, her thoughts humming. "Did you see who handled it that day?" "I saw Florence with it, then Clarissa. Then I lost track. There were too many people crowding the table." "And your quarrel with Mr. Smythe?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "He made my life quite small, Miss Marple. But I don't poison. I paint." Miss Marple stood, slowly. "Thank you, Eleanor. I believe your memory has cleared something important." That afternoon, Inspector Harrow received the same information, but he found it far less poetic. "Why wasn't this mentioned earlier?" he barked when Eleanor repeated her story at the station. "I told you no one would believe me," she said calmly. Harrow scratched at his chin. "So someone stole a sugar jar from your kitchen, used it at the vicar's tea, then doctored it to implicate you. Or at least use it as a vehicle." "That's what it seems. And the jar has now been sent to the lab." "Lovely." When she left, he turned to Miss Marple, who had arrived just in time to hear the end of the exchange. "Do you believe her?" "I believe she tells the truth," Miss Marple said, "which is not always the same as being innocent." He frowned. "You mean she might still be involved?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. I mean that people can tell the truth while still being part of something they don't fully understand." That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, sipping tea and watching the wind stir the ivy outside. Eleanor's stolen sugar jar changed everything. The poison, if that's what it was, had not simply been dropped into a communal dish by an opportunist. It had been planned, calculated. Someone had stolen a very specific object. Someone who knew where the jar came from and what it would suggest. But Miss Marple's mind drifted elsewhere, not to the sugar, but to the pattern of behavior. If Eleanor was being framed, who would benefit from casting suspicion away from themselves? Who knew the rhythms of the village well enough to exploit them? The answer, she thought, might not be in the jar, but in who noticed the jar had gone missing. She reached for her calendar again, scribbled a note beneath Thursday, watering begonias, and underlined it twice. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. By Tuesday morning, Weatherwood had grown suspicious of its own reflection. The warm summer light no longer felt comforting. It merely illuminated the cracks in friendships, in reputations, and in long-held assumptions. Conversations, once easy and meandering, now tiptoed like trespassers around the shadow of Arthur Smythe's death. At the heart of it all stood Miss Marple, a quiet observer in the middle of the storm, stitching her thoughts together with the same precision she applied to her embroidery floss. And the pattern was becoming clearer, though not yet complete. It was in this sharpened atmosphere that Florence Murch appeared at the vicarage, breathless and pale. She had come unannounced, clutching a folded note in her gloved hand. The vicar's wife, startled, invited her into the front parlor, where Florence hesitated only a moment before handing the note to Mrs. Ellingham. "I found it this morning, tucked into my sorting drawer," she said. It wasn't there yesterday. Mrs. Ellingham, perplexed, unfolded the note. It was written in block capitals, clipped and hurried. "Keep quiet about the jar, or you'll regret it." Florence's hands trembled. "I didn't want to go to the police just yet. I thought perhaps Miss Marple—" "Quite right," said a calm voice from the doorway. Miss Marple entered quietly, having arrived for her weekly flower-arranging visit, and overheard enough to join without surprise. She gently took the note, reading it with care. "No signature," she murmured. "No identifying mark on the paper. But this was no idle threat. Someone is afraid of what Florence might remember." Florence swallowed hard. "I didn't do anything." "No," said Miss Marple, "but you saw more than you think." Florence dropped her gaze. There was something odd about Clarissa that day, just before the raffle. She slipped away for a minute and came back wiping her hands. "I thought nothing of it then." "Wiping them on what?" "A white handkerchief," she said. "She tucked it into her pocket so quickly I almost thought I imagined it." Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Ellingham. "Could you ask the maid if any handkerchiefs were found after the tea? Misplaced or discarded?" "Of course," said the vicar's wife, already hurrying off. Miss Marple turned to Florence. "We must be cautious. This note, whoever wrote it, is watching, which means we are close to something." Meanwhile, Inspector Harrow was knocking at Clarissa Smythe's front door. She answered in a moss-green blouse and pearl earrings, serene as ever. "Back so soon, Inspector?" she asked, stepping aside. "I have a few questions," he said simply. "About the sugar jar." She paused. "Oh, still on that, are we?" "It may have come from Mrs. Chudley's kitchen," Harrow said, watching her eyes. "Without her permission." "Really?" Clarissa blinked. "That's rather strange. I thought Florence brought it." She seemed quite certain. "Florence says she returned it to the table. You were seen carrying something wrapped in your shawl not long after." Clarissa tilted her head. "Oh, that. No, just my scarf. It was chilly under the awning." "You weren't carrying a small jar?" "Certainly not." Harrow stared at her. "You were married to Arthur for nearly 10 years. Did you love him?" Clarissa hesitated. "I don't know that I ever had the chance. Arthur loved control, not companionship. And yet, no one recalls you arguing. We learn not to shout in public. That doesn't mean we never suffered in private. Did you know he had plans to change his will?" Now she smiled faintly. "No, but I'm hardly surprised. Arthur changed his mind like socks." Harrow narrowed his eyes. "You're a clever woman, Mrs. Smythe." Clarissa met his gaze. "And clever women don't poison men, Inspector. They leave them." Later that afternoon, Mrs. Ellingham returned to Miss Marple's cottage with a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "The maid found this behind the vicarage hedge, tucked into a watering can," she said, breathless. "I think it's what you were looking for." Inside was a white handkerchief, stained faintly with something brownish red. The initials CS were stitched in one corner. Miss Marple examined it without touching. "Tea," she said softly, "mixed with a bittering agent. The smell lingers." Mrs. Ellingham clutched the table. "That's Clarissa's." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but that doesn't necessarily make her guilty. Only closer to the truth." She spent the rest of the evening reviewing her notes by lamplight. The picture was starting to sharpen. A stolen sugar jar, a stained handkerchief, a veiled threat. But most telling of all was the timing. The poisoning hadn't been haphazard. It had occurred just before the raffle, when all attention was fixed elsewhere. A perfect moment to slip something into a teacup or to swap a container already compromised. But how had they known Arthur Smythe would choose sugar? Not everyone had, after all. Unless someone had observed his habits closely, known them well, perhaps even relied on them. Miss Marple paused mid-thought. Dr. Linton. Always nearby. Trusted. Unquestioned. And oddly quiet since the investigation began. She remembered now. He had taken Arthur's pulse when he collapsed. He had declared it likely a cardiac arrest, and no one had challenged it. Why would they? He was the doctor. The next morning, Miss Marple strolled to the village green, where Dr. Linton was trimming the edges of his rose beds. He greeted her with a smile that faltered slightly at the edges. "Lovely morning," he said. "It is," she replied. "Do you often add sugar to your tea, doctor?" "Linton?" He looked surprised. "Only when I'm tired. Why?" "Oh, no reason." She adjusted her hat. "I was just thinking. It's the small habits, isn't it? They define us, and sometimes they betray us." She smiled pleasantly and turned to go, leaving the doctor standing motionless beside his shears, brow slightly furrowed. She had cast a stone. Now she would wait to see which way the ripples traveled. Chapter 7. Another twist. It was the following afternoon when the rhythm of the village shifted once again, quietly, subtly, like a single discordant note in a familiar tune. Mrs. Hartley, the butcher's wife, discovered it while visiting her sister in Market Weatherly. At the bottom of a newsagent's notice board, mostly covered by advertisements for chimney sweeps and piano lessons, she spotted a brief obituary clipped from a local London paper. She'd nearly missed it entirely, until the name caught her eye. Dr. Charles Linton, formerly of Bloomsbury. Private hospital, disbarred, 1947. Her mouth fell open, and without waiting for her change, she bundled the paper into her bag and hurried back to Weatherwood like a woman carrying a lit match. By evening, the village hummed with the revelation. Whispers leapt from one doorstep to the next. Our Dr. Linton? Surely not. What does disbarred even mean for a doctor? Poisoning, they said. Not proven, of course, but hinted. He left London rather suddenly, didn't he? Miss Marple, hearing it third hand from her grocer's niece, closed her eyes for a brief moment of reflection. So the past had finally come to call. Dr. Linton was not new to scandal, only to Weatherwood. That evening, Inspector Harrow received a call from the Regional Medical Board. The news was succinct, clinical. Dr. Linton was forced to resign in 1947 under pressure. Allegations of mishandling medication. One patient died unexpectedly. The family refused a post-mortem. No legal action was taken, but his license was revoked for 5 years. And he never disclosed this when registering locally. Harrow asked, jaw tightening. He would not have been required to. The board reinstated his license in 1952. The call ended. Harrow rubbed a hand across his face. Suddenly, his two convenient suspects, Florence and Clarissa, seemed too convenient. And a third path, previously overlooked, had opened like a hidden door. At the next morning, Harrow found himself outside Dr. Linton's ivy-covered cottage. The door opened before he knocked. "Come in," said Linton, his smile calm but slightly rigid. "I've been expecting you." Inside, the air was scented faintly with thyme and disinfectant. The sitting room was spotless, save for a desk piled with medical journals and an ashtray containing 2 neatly stubbed cigarettes. "You've heard, I take it," said Linton, gesturing to a chair. "Yes," said Harrow. "You were struck off." "Temporarily. A political matter. A patient with underlying conditions died after receiving medication I prescribed. The family refused autopsy, but the hospital feared reputation damage. I was the scapegoat." "Why didn't you tell the village? Would you have listened to a doctor with a stained past? Would the vicar have welcomed me?" Harrow didn't answer. "And Arthur Smythe? Did he know?" Linton stiffened. "He suspected. I saw him in Market Weatherly 1 week before his death. speaking to a former colleague of mine. He asked pointed questions when I returned, said I owed the truth. I suspected he was planning to expose me. So you silenced him? Linton's gaze cooled. No, Inspector, that's precisely what I didn't do. I wanted to remain in Weatherwood, yes, but not badly enough to kill. What about the tea? Did you touch the sugar jar? I drank coffee. I brought my own thermos. I don't like raffles or weak tea. Everyone knows that. Harrow was quiet for a moment. One more thing. The moment Arthur collapsed, you declared cardiac arrest, without checking for other symptoms. I'm a doctor. I've seen sudden death before. Perhaps too many times, Harrow said grimly. Linton's expression didn't change, but his hands tightened slightly on the armrests. When Harrow left, he found Miss Marple sitting on a bench near the village green, feeding crumbs to the sparrows. You heard? He asked. She nodded. Mrs. Hartley has many talents. Discretion is not one of them. I don't know what to make of it, Miss Marple. Linton has motive, history, access, but he doesn't feel guilty, at least not in the way I expected. People rarely feel the way you expect, Miss Marple replied. That's why crimes are so often misunderstood. She brushed a stray crumb from her skirt. But we mustn't dismiss Clarissa yet, and Florence still hides something. The poisoner knew their habits well, Arthur's and the village's, which means it wasn't just opportunity, it was design. She paused. Let me tell you a little story, Inspector. About Mrs. Petheridge, who ran the post office in Much Benham. She used to rearrange the tea tins every Tuesday to disguise how much sugar she used, because she was on a diet but didn't want to appear vain. Her neighbor, noticing the routine, once added a tablespoon of salt instead of sugar to her canister just to tease her. Mrs. Petheridge drank it without noticing. What's your point? Harrow asked, bemused. Miss Marple smiled. That people don't always notice what's done in plain sight. But those who plan their habits and manipulate others are far more dangerous. That night, as the village buzzed with the doctor's past, another discovery was made, this time by the vicar's son, Paul, who had been tasked with organizing leftover raffle materials in the church's storage shed. He found a brown glass medicine bottle nestled behind a stack of hymn books. He brought it, hands shaking, to the vicar, who sent for Harrow at once. The label had been torn off, but a faint trace of white powder lined the inside. The stopper was greasy. Someone had used it, carefully, then discarded it carelessly. Miss Marple, upon seeing it, simply nodded. There, she said, that isn't evidence of guilt, but it is evidence of intention. And now the village had not only a motive and a method, but an object. The net was tightening. And somewhere, the killer, once confident and composed, was beginning to feel it pull. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The air in Weatherwood had turned heavy, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Clouds hung low over the rooftops, and even the birds seemed subdued. There was a tension to the wind, one that stirred curtains and unsettled teacups on their saucers. Something was coming, though none could say quite what. Miss Marple knew. She had seen the pieces move too carefully, the lies stacked too cleanly, the trails laid too neatly. There was intention here, not the heat of a violent crime, but the cold, deliberate steps of someone who had rehearsed their innocence as thoroughly as they had rehearsed the murder. And it was time to test the structure. It began, as such things often did, with tea. Miss Marple had invited 5 guests to her drawing room that afternoon. Florence Murch, Mrs. Ellingham, Dr. Linton, Clarissa Smythe, and Inspector Harrow. The invitation was gentle, understated. She phrased it as a conversation, not a confrontation. Just a moment to reflect, you understand. A little clarity before conclusions are drawn. Each had come out of curiosity, some more reluctantly than others. Clarissa arrived last, wrapped in a silver-gray shawl, her expression unreadable. Florence, already seated beside the hearth, barely glanced at her. Dr. Linton stood stiffly near the bookshelf, arms folded, while Mrs. Ellingham fidgeted with her gloves. Harrow remained quiet, observing the others with the patience of a man watching pieces arrange themselves on a chessboard. The table was set modestly, no pastries, just a polished silver teapot, plain biscuits, and a familiar porcelain sugar jar, its lid slightly chipped, deliberately so. Miss Marple poured without fuss. "Sugar?" she asked, offering the tongs first to Florence. Florence hesitated. "No, thank you." "To you, Clarissa?" Clarissa gave a faint smile. "I think not." Dr. Linton waved it off. "Never do." Mrs. Ellingham accepted 2 cubes, as she always did, stirring absently. Miss Marple poured last for herself, leaving her cup untouched. She sat, her eyes gentle, her voice soft. "I think it's time we speak plainly." The room stilled. "I've lived in this village long enough to know its rhythms," she continued. "And I've learned that when a crime is committed here, it is not out of madness or impulse. It is out of reason. Twisted reason, perhaps, but reason all the same." Florence glanced at the clock. "You see," Miss Marple said, folding her hands, "this murder, Arthur Smythe's, was not just about removing a man. It was about controlling a story, about making sure that guilt landed somewhere tidy. And that, my friends, is the work of someone who knows us far too well." She paused. "We now know the sugar jar was not Clarissa's. It was taken from Mrs. Chudley's cottage days before the tea. That alone suggests premeditation, not a spur-of-the-moment act, a choice made long before the event, a script written and rehearsed." Clarissa's gaze darkened slightly. "Are you suggesting someone meant to implicate me?" "Not you," Miss Marple said, "but someone like you. Someone believable. Someone with just enough of a motive to make the story work." She turned to Florence. "You said you found the sugar jar beside the hydrangeas, but you didn't tell anyone until it was convenient. You were the first to speak of the odd smell, the first to find the note warning you to stay silent, the first to direct suspicion toward Clarissa." Florence's voice tightened. "Are you accusing me of murder?" "No," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I'm asking you why every clue has passed through your hands." A pause. Florence opened her mouth, but no sound came. Clarissa leaned forward slightly. "She hated Arthur. She hated me." Florence's eyes flashed. "He humiliated me." There it was, too quick, too deep to be rehearsed. Dr. Linton stepped forward, voice low. "You were always kind, Florence, but I never gave you reason to believe I know," she said sharply, "but you were all I had left to admire." Miss Marple's voice was gentle now. "Florence, you used kindness like camouflage. That was your genius. You knew the village would never suspect you. You counted on it." Tears welled, but did not fall. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Florence whispered. "Only him. Only Arthur. He was going to destroy Linton. He told me. He said he'd make it impossible for him to work again. He already started writing letters." She turned to Clarissa, eyes wide. "You wouldn't have cared. You never cared about anyone but yourself." Clarissa stood slowly. "I didn't know. About the letters. About what he planned." Florence let out a bitter laugh. "Of course not. You never looked at anyone for long enough." Inspector Harrow stepped forward. "Florence Murch, you're admitting you stole the sugar jar, poisoned it, and placed it with the refreshments that day." "Yes," she said quietly. "But I did it alone." I planted the handkerchief to draw suspicion. I'm not proud of that. Miss Marple rose. There's something important I want you to understand, she said to the room. Florence didn't act in a vacuum. Her resentment grew quietly, fed by Arthur's cruelty, Clarissa's indifference, the village's blind eyes. That doesn't excuse her crime, but it explains her silence. And her silence was what allowed this to happen. The room was very still. Florence looked exhausted now, as though she had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. I just wanted someone to stop him, she said. And someone did, Miss Marple said, her voice almost a whisper. But at what cost? Inspector Harrow stepped beside her. I'll need you to come with me, Florence. She nodded, and without another word, she rose and followed him out. When the room was empty, Miss Marple remained standing by the cold teapot, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Ellingham spoke first. Do you think we all missed it? Yes, Miss Marple said, but we missed her, not just the clues. Clarissa stepped forward. Did she hate me, truly? Miss Marple looked at her. Not hate. Envy, perhaps. And disappointment. She saw in you what she thought she could never be. Clarissa's voice was flat. And what do I do now? Miss Marple smiled faintly. You live, but you live differently. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her garden. The sky had cleared, and the light was softening. She sat on her usual bench, a cup of tea untouched beside her, watching as a robin hopped along the edge of the flower bed. She didn't feel triumphant. She rarely did. The solving of a mystery was never victory. It was restoration, of truth, of peace, of balance. But never joy. Not when someone had to lose themselves to make the mystery happen in the first place. A crime was a bruise on a place. And though Weatherwood would heal, it would do so with a scar. She looked toward the hydrangeas, now blooming in thick pinks and whites, and thought of Florence's pressed violet. The one in the envelope. The one left without words of defense. Sometimes, Miss Marple thought, people only become visible once they've vanished. And that is the quietest tragedy of all. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The morning after Miss Marple's quiet confrontation, Weatherwood felt strangely hushed, as though the entire village were holding its breath. Rain had fallen softly overnight, dappling the pavements and lending the hedgerows a dew-soaked sheen. Birds fluttered in the hedges as though unaware that something irrevocable had shifted beneath the cobblestones and creeping ivy. Miss Marple, dressed in a subdued shade of lavender, made her way to the police station just after 10. She carried no notes, no files, only the contents of her mind, which she had arranged as methodically as her spice rack. Every detail was now in place, every silence had been noted, every reaction observed. Inside the small station, Inspector Harrow stood at the window, arms folded, staring at the drizzle. He turned as she entered. "You've come to finish it," he said. She nodded, lowering herself carefully into the chair opposite his desk. "Yes, Inspector. I believe I have." He waited, pen poised. No interruption, no preamble. Just her voice, calm and clear. "I will begin where it always begins," she said. "Not with opportunity nor method, but with motive. In village murders, particularly those involving poison, one must look not for rage but for control. Poison is a slow and deliberate weapon. It requires patience, planning, and above all, the desire to destroy quietly." She folded her gloved hands. Arthur Smythe was not an admirable man. He was clever, yes, powerful in his way. But he was not kind. Over the years he used his wealth and position to humiliate others. Florence Murch, Eleanor Chudley, even Dr. Linton. But only one person lived in the cage he built. "Clarissa?" Harrow said softly. "Yes, his wife." At first glance, she appears the perfect suspect. She had motive, proximity, and as I observed last night, a very careful way of concealing guilt. But there was a flaw in that performance, one so small it might have been missed. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. She didn't react. Not to the handkerchief, not to the sugar jar, not even to the poison bottle discovered behind the hymn books. Clarissa was prepared. Too prepared. She knew exactly what had been found, where it had been planted, and when questions would be asked. That tells us two things. She anticipated discovery, and she didn't act alone. Harrow raised an eyebrow. You're saying? There were two? Yes, a partnership, but one far more manipulative than cooperative. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded piece of the Vicarage Committee's bulletin. This, she said, was the clue that changed everything. The sugar jar was not Clarissa's. It came from Eleanor Chudley's kitchen. It was taken days before the tea. That's not improvisation. That's choreography. Someone planted the poisoned sugar in a jar associated with a known grudge, hoping the blame would settle neatly on Eleanor. But to do that, they needed to know the jar would be used. Miss Marple's voice softened. And that could only be someone who helped organize the refreshments. Harrow froze. Florence. Miss Marple gave a small, sad nod. Florence Murch. Not the most obvious suspect, but when you look closely, she's everywhere. She knew who was bringing what. She handled the sugar jar. She conveniently found the note warning her to stay silent. She presented herself as the frightened whistleblower. But she was writing the tune all along. But the handkerchief? Harrow asked. The one with Clarissa's initials. She planted it, Miss Marple said. Florence had access to Clarissa's laundry through the local washerwoman, Mrs. Peggs. I made inquiries. Clarissa's handkerchiefs were pressed and collected 3 days before the tea. Florence took one, perhaps exchanged it, and later used it to create a false trail. Harrow sat down slowly, the weight of it settling across his shoulders. But why? He murmured. What did Florence have to gain? Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. Love? She said. Or rather, the idea of it. You see, Florence Murch had admired Dr. Linton for years. Quietly, distantly. He was kind to her, perhaps without even realizing the impression he left. But to Florence it grew into something larger. She saw Clarissa Smythe flirt with the doctor, saw her husband treat her with disdain, and perhaps in some deeply twisted logic she thought, I'll remove him. Then she'll be alone. And perhaps one day, I won't be invisible anymore. Miss Marple's eyes saddened. It wasn't just revenge against Arthur Smythe. It was longing, disguised as justice. But longing is a dangerous seed when planted in bitterness. Harrow stood and walked to the door. Outside, the mist clung to the grass. She played us, he said. Not quite, said Miss Marple, rising. Because even the cleverest poisoner cannot anticipate every response. She didn't expect the doctor's disbarment to come to light. Didn't expect Clarissa to hold her ground. And she didn't expect me to notice the direction of her gaze. Every time the name Dr. Linton was mentioned, she flushed. Harrow turned. We'll need a confession. Miss Marple nodded. Then you must give her a choice. Bring Clarissa and Florence into the same room. Ask Florence one simple question in front of the other. Why did you choose that day? Why that tea? Her answer will betray her. An hour later, Florence and Clarissa sat opposite each other in the drawing room of the station. Inspector Harrow paced slowly. You both know why you're here, he said. Clarissa stared ahead, face unreadable. Florence clutched her handbag like a lifeline. I have one question, Harrow said, turning to Florence. Why did you poison Arthur Smythe at the vicarage tea? Why not another time? Florence blinked. I didn't. Miss Marple believes you chose the tea because it gave you the best cover, the best timing, the most likely distraction. She believes you planted the evidence to implicate Clarissa. Florence's mouth opened, but no words came. You stole the sugar jar from Mrs. Chudley. You used Clarissa's handkerchief. You knew Arthur's habits. You sorted his mail, handled his parcels. You knew what time he would take tea. You knew he'd take sugar. No, she said faintly. That's not... Clarissa stood then, slowly. You were always watching him, she said. But never for his sake. For Dr. Linton. That's why you hated me. Florence turned sharply. You think I did this for you? I did this because he humiliated me. Treated me like a servant. Like I was nothing. Her voice cracked. And he was going to ruin Dr. Linton. He told me. He said he was sending letters to the board again. I thought if I removed him, no one would be hurt. Not really. He was already hated. Clarissa's face went pale. But you poisoned him, she said softly. You killed him. Florence's breath stuttered. He was cruel. You don't understand what it's like to be made small your entire life. To be invisible. Inspector Harrow stepped forward. Florence Murch, you are under arrest for the murder of Arthur Smythe. The room fell into silence. Florence lowered her gaze. He never even saw me, she whispered. Miss Marple, watching from the hallway, closed her eyes. There it was, the truth, as quiet as the murder itself. That evening, the rain cleared. Weatherwood's lanes shimmered under golden light, as though nothing had happened. But in the hearts of its residents, a quiet unease lingered, less about the murder, and more about how close it had come to being perfectly concealed. In her cottage, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. 2 rows of pearl, 3 rows of plain. She thought of Florence, of Clarissa, of the bitter fragility of admiration and the sharper edge of loneliness. Then she sighed, snipped the yarn with delicate scissors, and folded the half-finished scarf into her drawer. For even in the softest villages, patterns break. And somewhere, behind the tea and flowers, someone always bleeds quietly. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. The summer in Weatherwood passed quietly after the arrest. The hydrangeas bloomed again, children played hopscotch on the village green, and the vicarage resumed its hum of potlucks and scripture readings. But the stillness was different now. Less innocent, more observant, like the village had learned to glance twice before trusting a smile. Florence Murch remained in custody, awaiting trial. The official charges had been filed. Premeditated murder with intent to deceive. She had confessed in full, though quietly, with the odd dignity of someone unburdening themselves. No tears, no outburst, just a soft-spoken account of anger, longing, and the slow burn of being overlooked. The village, in turn, didn't quite know how to grieve her. Florence had been theirs after all, part of the church raffle, the postal hours, the Tuesday afternoon rhythm of things. Her crime made people uneasy, not only because of what she'd done, but because of what she had managed to hide. And as for Clarissa Smythe, she left. 3 days after Florence's confession, she packed her things into a small blue car and drove away from Weatherwood without announcing her destination. Some said she went to Bath, others claimed she had an aunt in Cornwall. Miss Marple thought she had simply grown tired of being watched. It wasn't guilt that haunted Clarissa. It was the shame of being used, of becoming a pawn in someone else's private drama. But the villagers needed closure, and in time, they would tell themselves stories to make sense of it all. Florence had always been odd, too quiet, too proud. They would forget the things she had done for them, the parcels delivered in storms, the birthday cards remembered without reminders. That too was human nature. Miss Marple, however, remembered everything. On a golden Thursday afternoon, she received a letter. It arrived in a pale envelope, with neat but unadorned script. Inside were only 2 items, a single sheet of stationery and a pressed violet. The letter read, "Miss Marple, you saw me even when I didn't want to be seen." I don't know if that was kindness or cruelty, but it was the truth. I don't expect forgiveness, only understanding. The pressed flower is from the hedge behind the vicarage. I suppose I wanted something to survive from that day, even if I didn't. F. Miss Marple stared at it for a long moment before folding it back into the envelope. She placed it in her desk drawer beside a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1947 about Dr. Linton's disbarment, and a small note scribbled by Eleanor Chudleigh, thanking her for believing in her innocence. Each item a thread, each thread part of the larger pattern. Later that week, Inspector Harrow stopped by her cottage, hat in hand. He had taken to visiting her now and then, partly out of respect, partly in search of wisdom that could not be found in reports or handbooks. "She'll likely serve 15 years, he said, settling into the chair beside her garden window. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "though the sentence matters less than the cause. You see, Inspector, Florence was not born to kill. She was simply left unnoticed too long. And bitterness, once it takes root, blooms in the oddest directions." Harrow nodded, though he looked troubled. "I keep thinking, if someone had paid her more mind, if someone had asked her how she was." "But someone did," Miss Marple said gently. "We all did, just not in the way she needed." There was silence for a moment, filled only by the breeze rustling through the geraniums. "She was clever," Harrow said finally. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but cleverness without kindness is a dangerous thing. It becomes brittle, weaponized." "And the doctor?" he asked. "Do you think he suspected her?" "I believe he suspected someone," she replied, "but not her. That was her true victory. Florence knew how to remain invisible, even in plain sight. It was her greatest strength, and ultimately, her downfall." Harrow nodded slowly, absorbing the thought. "You know," he said with a small smile, "I used to think of Weatherwood as dull." Miss Marple chuckled. "Most do, until the tea turns bitter." That evening, as dusk settled over the rooftops and the air filled with the scent of honeysuckle and peat smoke, Miss Marple went to the vicarage garden. Mrs. Ellingham had invited her to inspect the new flower bed, tulips mostly, and a curious red lily whose name no one could recall. They spoke quietly as they walked. "I still can't believe it," Mrs. Ellingham said, kneeling to adjust a crooked stem. "Florence of all people. I trusted her." Miss Marple offered a quiet smile. "Trust isn't wasted simply because it's misplaced. It's part of living." "I suppose you're right. Still, will the village ever feel the same?" "No," said Miss Marple, "but that may not be a bad thing. We grow stronger when we remember to look beneath appearances." They continued down the path, the silence companionable. At the far end of the garden, the sugar jar had been placed on a pedestal near the hydrangeas, not as a shrine, but as a reminder. The vicar, with his fondness for symbolic gestures, had decided to make it part of the church's summer display. Miss Marple stepped close to it now, peering at the small porcelain container, its lid chipped at the edge. "It was never really about the sugar," she said aloud. "It was about the bitter taste underneath." And so Weatherwood carried on. There were teas again, of course, cautious at first, then increasingly cheerful. New raffles were held. Mrs. Hartley's marmalade won second place at the county fair. Dr. Linton quietly relocated to another town, and Mrs. Chudleigh returned to her painting, hosting exhibitions in her garden on warm Sundays. The village learned, slowly, not to glance away from loneliness, not to mistake quietness for harmlessness, not to forget that harm can come dressed in the gentlest cardigan and carried on the softest smile. Miss Marple resumed her routine, a tidy breakfast, a mid-morning walk, a pot of strong Darjeeling, and letters answered by hand. She never spoke much about the case again, but sometimes, as she stirred her tea without sugar, her gaze would drift to the window, not out of fear, but remembrance. Because every murder, in its quietest echo, is not about